So in the last video about regarding GDP, we talked about ways to break down GDP by who gets the output. We've got households, we call those goods made for households, consumption goods and services. We've got businesses, and those goods made for businesses, we call those investment goods and services. The government, which call that government goods and services. And then finally, goods and services made for the foreign sector, we call that net exports. So based upon that, we could break down GDP in an equation. This is GDP is C plus I plus G plus NX. C are goods and services made for households. I, investment goods and services for businesses. G, goods and services for the government. And net exports, exports minus imports. These are goods and services made for the foreign sector. And if you look at how it relates to each one for the United States, you could see that goods and services made for households is about 70% of all activity for the United States. Now, this is very high. Most countries, most developed economies, have a consumption goods and services right around 60 to 63%. The United States is very high, and most of that is uh, because of healthcare spending. A lot of countries, let's say European countries and Canada, they have healthcare produced by the government. And so when you spend money on healthcare services in Canada, it gets grouped under the government purchases part. So this is one of the reasons why this is so high. But this is how the United States looks in terms of who gets the output. Most of the output produced are made for households, about 17% for businesses, and about 16%, 18% for the government. Now, once you could break down GDP by who gets the output, what you then could do is now you can make better sense of the economic data that comes out every single day for any particular country. For example, one very widely reported economic indicator is called retail sales. That comes out every month and it's reported by the Census Bureau. That says something about this part of the economy, the C part of the economy. This is all of the sales by the largest retailers in the United States. Then for I, there is one of the things counted under investment goods and services are new homes. And there is a monthly indicator called housing starts and permits. That says something about the I part of GDP. What about non-residential fixed investment? That's equipment, let's say, for a business. Well, there's a monthly economic indicator called durable goods. That says something about the I part. And then state, federal, and local have budget reports. That says something about spending on output for the government. And finally, we have a trade report, a monthly trade report that says something about net exports. This is just a sample of economic data that comes out that reports on some part of the economy. So, once you've established the relationship between spending and economic data, you can now start to identify relationships between economic indicators. For example, let's say there's a sudden change in consumer spending. This sudden change in consumer spending will affect inventory levels at stores. So when you have a change in a drop in inventory, wholesalers, retailers will make adjustments to try to get those inventories back up to a level that they feel comfortable with. Now, by trying to increase their inventories, that's going to change production. So this is starting a chain of events that can be measured by economic data. Let me give you another way of explaining this. Take a look at this first box. Let's say there's a sudden increase in consumer spending. Unexpected. What this will cause retail inventories at stores to fall. Well, if retail inventories are falling, those retailers are going to put in new orders. Now, if factories are getting new orders, that also means there's going to be an increase in imports. Because if people are spending a lot of money, they're also spending money on imports. Well, if there are new factory orders, you could expect new shipments from those factories. Now, as factories produce more, factories also carry inventories, and their factory inventories, you would expect them to fall. Now, with factory inventories falling, you could expect factories to start increasing production to replenish their inventories. Now, if they've got to produce more, you could expect them to make the workers work longer hours. You could expect the work week to lengthen. And you could also would expect those manufacturers to import more raw materials. Well, if you're producing more, you're going to have to hire more workers. Now, if you want to hire more workers, you may have to offer higher wages. If wages are going up, income is going up. If incomes are going up, you could expect more spending. Now, take a look at the very first box and the very last box. This started a chain reaction that's basically feeding itself. Each one of these boxes can be represented by an economic indicator. And so what you see is you have kind of a chain reaction where you could start anticipating future changes in economic data. And it all starts by first trying to measure the economy, GDP. Then you break down the economy into parts, C plus I plus G plus NX, and then you start identifying economic data that reports on a particular part of the economy. Now, we could use spending to measure the value of all output, but we also could that's called the expenditure approach. You could also use income to measure the value of all output. You could look at all of the income earned in the production process. That must equal all of the spending for that particular output. So they're two sides of the same coin. So the total market value of income must equal the total value of all output, or GDP. So the value of all output equals the income earned in the production of all that output. So you can see here, the value of all output, we can measure that by spending, the spending on consumer goods, the spending on investment, the government. That's got to equal the value of all income producing that output. And the income includes wages, profits, interest, and rent. So you could see here on the left-hand side, we're trying to measure GDP by looking at spending on new output. That equals almost $11 trillion. But what if we actually looked at all of the income earned in the production of this output? You're going to get the exact same number. Now, some people look at measuring the economy, in this case GDP, as a way of measuring, let's say, the quality of life, standard of living. Remember, per capita GDP is another way of representing average income. But does this do a good job in measuring quality of life? In other words, if GDP growth is high, if per capita GDP is high, does that mean welfare in a particular country is high? Well, in 1990, the United Nations launched their Human Development Report. And what they did is they created an indicator to try to measure well-being. They called this the Human Development Index, the HDI. But the big difference here is they did take into account GDP, per capita GDP, right here. But they included two other indicators to give you a more holistic measurement of well-being. They included life expectancy and education. And what's interesting is take a look at a country, let's say like the United States, in the HDI index. The United States is 13th. Now, the United States, if you look at per capita GDP, this is the last column, per capita GDP was 54,000. But look at a country like Canada. Canada had a lower per capita GDP, but they had a higher HDI score because Canada scored higher in terms of life expectancy, a little bit lower in education, but overall they had a higher HDI. And so you could see Norway came up top with the highest HDI score. They had one of the highest per capita GDP, one of the highest life expectancy, and they scored very well in education. So HDI takes into account GDP, but it adds other indicators to give you a more complete picture of how well the typical person is doing in a particular country. And here's a nice little graph that shows you that it measures per capita, per capita GDP on the horizontal axis and HDI on the vertical axis. And what this basically tells you is when you have growth in per capita GDP, you see big increases in your HDI growth. But once your per capita GDP gets to about right here, you see that there is not much of, let me give you a little line here. Let me see if I could change the color. I'm going to change this to yellow right here. Okay, so you can see at low levels of per capita GDP, you see this rapid growth in HDI. But once you get to right about here in per capita GDP, you see that the growth slows and flattens, which means once a country reaches a certain stage of development in terms of per capita GDP, they don't get a big boost in their HDI score. You've got to look towards other areas of development to improve standards of living. And again, this shows trends, recent trends from 1980 to the early 2010s. And you could see how the OECD countries, Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, those are what we call developed economies. You could see the trend there. And then you've got the United States in green, and you've got the world in orange. And you could see the United States has been relatively flat from about 2000 to 2010 in terms of their HDI development. Now, where I want to leave you is the fact that GDP is a way of measuring economic activity. It's a way of measuring the economy. And we've went over how to break down GDP into parts, C plus I plus G plus NX. We went over the measurement problems. But basically, this is the patient. GDP is the patient. And we're going to, from this point on in the class, we're going to start trying to report on the health of the patient by looking at different vital signs. And those vital signs are economic indicators. And that's where we're going to leave it for now.